The fog hung low over the Montana Valley that morning, thick and trembling as if it had a secret it could barely hold. Each fence post gleamed with frost, fragile silver scars against the brown of the fading autumn grass. Calder Rourke rode out of his barn without a word, boots crunching through the brittle crust of frozen dirt, shoulders drawn inward against a cold that had nothing to do with the wind. He hadn't spoken much in weeks, not to the horses, not to the empty house, not even to the ghosts of his own thoughts. Grief was a companion that wrapped itself around him like a second skin, and the ranch, sprawling and lonely, only made it feel heavier. 3 horses appeared at the edge of the pasture, their heads raised and ears pricked, eyes locking onto him with an intensity that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. Dusty, Rowan, and Belle, his oldest mounts, circled him slowly, never aggressive, just insistent, as if they carried a message that Calder had to hear. He frowned and nudged his horse forward, thinking it a trick of the fog, some strange behavior born of boredom. But the horses would not be moved. They blocked him, shuffled, and pawed the frozen earth in a way that demanded attention. He paused, exhaling through clenched teeth, the quiet settling around him like a held breath. His own heartbeat thudded loud in his ears as he studied their faces. There was a pleading, almost human quality in their gaze. Something in their insistence reached deep into a corner of Calder's chest that had long been untouched. A spark of unease pricked at him. He had ridden these lands for decades, and never had horses led him anywhere not like this. But he didn't know those horses were about to change everything. Reluctantly, Calder allowed them to guide him down the overgrown trail at the edge of the ranch, past crumbling fence lines and chokecherry thickets heavy with frost. The path was narrow, almost lost to the wilds of neglect, and the horses moved with a purposeful grace. Calder followed in silence, the reins loose in his hands as memories he had buried surfaced like weeds breaking through hard soil. The mornings when he had ignored warnings, the times he had failed to act, the quiet regret that had become a constant companion, all of it seemed to ride alongside him now. The fog deepened as the trail descended into a small ravine, the earth slick from last night's rain. A faint, trembling sound rose from below, a soft, pitiful whinny that made Calder's chest tighten with sudden urgency. He dismounted slowly, boots sinking into the damp mud, and peered over the edge. Below him, tangled in fallen branches and half buried in mud, was a small horse. Its coat was matted and dull, ribs pressing against thin skin, eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. The animal shivered violently, legs trembling as it struggled against the earth's cruel grip. Calder felt a sharp stab of recognition, not just of the creature's pain, but of a truth he had tried to avoid. Suffering could not be ignored, and some calls were impossible to refuse. What he found hidden there nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. The 3 horses above pawed the ground and nickered softly, urging him toward the trapped animal. Calder's first instinct was hesitation. He had been broken, his own strength stretched thin by solitude and sorrow. Could he save this fragile life when he could barely save himself? But as he looked into the frightened eyes of the small horse, something in him shifted, something ancient and stubborn, a call to act that overrode fear. The air smelled of wet earth and fallen leaves as he climbed down carefully, each movement deliberate, mindful of the fragile form below. His hands, roughened by decades of labor, brushed against the horse's matted mane, careful not to startle it. Whispering words he did not know he still had in him, he worked inch by inch to free the animal from its tangled prison. Mud squelched beneath his boots, fingers scraped and torn, and yet he did not stop. Each branch removed, each gentle nudge of reassurance, was a promise that he would not abandon this creature. And the horse, sensing the unexpected kindness, allowed him to help. It shivered violently at first, then gradually, almost imperceptibly, leaned into his presence. A flicker of trust glimmered in its wide, terrified eyes, and Calder felt a pang of emotion so raw it left his chest tight and aching. This was no ordinary rescue, it was a meeting of 2 broken souls, an unspoken acknowledgement that both had been waiting for something, to show them a path back. The moral crossroads hovered like a shadow in the cold morning. He could leave, retreat to the solitude he had perfected, ignore the pleading eyes of the horse and the persistent nudges of Dusty, Rowan, and Belle. Or he could stay, risk failure, risk exhaustion, and give of himself when he felt hollowed out. Calder exhaled slowly, letting the cold air fill his lungs, and made the choice. He would stay. Slowly, he lifted the trembling horse into his arms, feeling its fragile weight press against him like a living question, a test he had to pass. Mud streaked his jacket, hair fell into his eyes, and he felt a single tear slip down his cheek as he carried it toward the safety of the barn. The 3 guiding horses trotted beside him, their steps steady, silent approval in every movement. In that quiet, frostbitten morning, the ranch felt less like an empty expanse and more like a place of possibility. Calder realized that for the first time in months, maybe years, he was moving toward something beyond survival. Toward care, toward connection, toward hope. The horse in his arms trembled, but not from fear alone. There was the faintest pulse of recognition, a fragile trust that mirrored his own tentative awakening. And in the silence, Calder understood. He didn't know it yet, but this moment would rewrite his entire life. The barn doors creaked as he entered, the smell of hay and wood enveloping them. He laid the horse gently on a bed of straw, brushing away mud and leaves, whispering reassurances with each careful motion. The 3 horses waited at the gate, watching, patient witnesses to the beginning of a bond neither Calder nor the animal fully understood. Outside, the fog lifted slowly, revealing the sharp outline of the surrounding mountains. Sunlight, weak but insistent, touched the barn roof with soft gold. It was a quiet morning, ordinary in appearance, yet extraordinary in the currents of transformation flowing beneath the surface. Calder knelt beside the horse, brushing its mane with hands steadier than they had been in years. The creature's warmth pressed into him, a tiny heartbeat against his chest, and he allowed himself, just for a moment, to hope. Somewhere deep in that barn, under the soft light and the gentle nicker of 3 patient horses, the first threads of healing began to weave themselves. And so began the story neither of them expected. 2 broken beings drawn together by chance, guided by quiet insistence, moving toward a future neither had dared imagine. The first night passed slowly, each tick of the old barn clock echoing in the hollow space like a heartbeat. Calder did not leave Whisper's side. He sat on a rough bale of hay, knees drawn to his chest, brushing the damp, matted fur along her neck. The warmth of her body pressed faintly against him, tremors of fear still rippling through muscles that had known too much pain. Outside, the wind whispered through the cracks in the barn walls, carrying with it the soft murmur of the 3 horses waiting at the gate. Dusty, Rowan, and Bell shifted, nuzzling one another, their eyes glimmering with quiet approval. Calder had learned long ago that animals could feel more than they let on. They remembered what humans often forgot. He fed her slowly, hand by hand, a mixture of soaked hay and soft oats, watching for any sign of hesitation. At first, she flinched at his touch, recoiling as though expecting some hidden betrayal. The muscles along her spine twitched, ears folding flat, nostrils flaring at every sound. But Calder did not speak. He simply allowed her presence, holding his hand out again and again, letting the seconds stretch into minutes, letting silence become trust. He remembered his father's words once, when he had been too young to understand them. Patience doesn't come from waiting. It comes from being present. That night he felt it for the first time in decades. By dawn, Whisper had taken a tentative bite. It was almost imperceptible, a delicate nibble that might have been ignored by anyone else. But Calder's heart leapt at the gesture, the tiniest thread of connection forming between them. He whispered soft encouragement, words that felt more like prayers than speech, and she leaned just slightly closer, testing the warmth of his palms. The 3 guiding horses watched from the gate, their heads held high, silent witnesses to a bond that was beginning to take shape. The next morning brought a delicate rhythm of small victories. Calder would feed, clean, and tend to Whisper, moving slowly and deliberately, giving her space to respond. At first, she resisted every touch, every attempt to guide her toward health. Calder could feel her hesitation, the imprint of past abuse or abandonment etched into each movement, each wary glance. Yet he persisted, not with force but with quiet, unwavering presence. Day by day he learned her rhythms, the subtle twitch of an ear signaling fear, the shift of weight indicating readiness for trust, the faint nicker that meant she was acknowledging him as a safe harbor. Whisper's first true gesture of trust came one chilly afternoon when the sun dipped low, washing the barn in a gentle orange glow. Calder had laid a blanket over her fragile frame, his hands lingering longer than usual along her neck. She shifted slightly, pressing her muzzle against his shoulder in a motion so small it might have been missed by a casual observer. But for Calder, it was a revelation, a whisper of connection that felt louder than any shout. His breath caught, and he sank to his knees beside her, letting the tears he had held for so long finally escape. The days passed in quiet ritual. Calder learned patience in ways he hadn't known he was capable of. The soft murmur of oats being soaked, the gentle brush against tangled fur, the silence shared between 2 beings who had both known fear, these became their language. Whisper, though still fragile, began to respond to his touch with fleeting gestures of acceptance, resting her head on his chest or nudging his shoulder with gentle insistence. Calder, in turn, allowed himself to soften, to remember the feeling of caring for another being without expectation or judgment. It was during one of these quiet moments that Calder noticed the faint mark on her flank. At first it seemed like a random brand, barely visible beneath the mud and matted fur. But as he traced it carefully with his fingers, cleaning away the dirt, recognition stirred uneasily in his chest. This was not a wild horse. She had been hidden, deliberately removed from sight, her story erased except for the faint mark that refused to lie. Calder paused, feeling the weight of a mystery pressing against the soft warmth of her trembling body. He looked up at the 3 horses at the gate, their eyes steady and unwavering, and felt an echo of the old instinct he had long ignored. Some truths were meant to be uncovered, no matter the cost. Over the next week, the bond between Calder and Whisper deepened in ways that could not be measured in gestures alone. Their connection was quiet but profound, built in moments of presence rather than grand declarations. He found himself lingering in the barn long after chores were done, simply watching her breathe, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the tiny signs of comfort and trust. Whisper, in turn, allowed herself to rest closer to him, her tremors lessening, her eyes softer. Each day the shadows of fear receded, replaced by a tentative hope that neither had dared to name aloud. One evening, after the sky had turned a soft violet and the first stars pricked through the darkness, Whisper pressed her head fully against Calder's chest. He wrapped his arms around her neck, feeling the fragile weight of her trust, and let the tears he had buried for so long flow freely. There were no words, none were needed. In the quiet, he understood the profound truth that had begun to settle in his heart. This was not simply a rescue. This was a mutual salvation, a reclamation of brokenness into something tender, something whole. But the bond did not exist in isolation. Slowly, whispers spread through the small town about the rescued horse and the weathered cowboy who refused to give up on her. Children, lonely teens, and veterans curious or cautious came to the edge of the ranch, drawn by the story, drawn by the quiet miracle of a connection born of patience and care. Calder noticed the looks exchanged at the fence line, the way hesitant hands reached toward Whisper, the soft smiles that returned to faces long unused to joy. It was subtle at first, a ripple rather than a wave, but it was undeniable. The bond they shared was beginning to awaken something in others as well. And yet, even as the barn filled with quiet watchers and timid visitors, Calder focused on the small victories, the steady weight of Whisper leaning into his chest, the subtle relaxation of her muscles, the gentle flicker of trust in her gaze. These moments, unremarkable to the world outside the barn, held more significance than any accolade or recognition. Each gesture was a testament to the slow, deliberate work of love, of patience, of being present when the world seemed determined to strip away hope. One evening, Calder stood outside the barn, watching Whisper step out into the soft glow of the setting sun, her coat shining faintly in the golden light. The 3 horses at the gate shifted as she approached, welcoming her as one of their own. Calder's chest ached with a quiet joy he had not known in years. He understood finally that this was only the beginning. Whisper had been saved, yes, but she had also saved him, reopening a heart long shut, reminding him that connection, however fragile, could flourish if nurtured with patience and tenderness. And just as the shadows lengthened and the first stars appeared, Calder realized he had begun to hope again. Not the fleeting, fragile hope he had known in passing, but the kind that could endure. He felt the subtle shift in the barn, in Whisper, in himself, and knew that soon the story would reach beyond the fences, beyond the barn, beyond the quiet valley itself. But he did not yet know the full measure of what was to come. The days grew warmer, and the early frost that had painted the valley white melted into the soft green of late autumn grass. Calder noticed subtle changes in the barn's rhythm. Children from the town lingered at the fence, shy smiles peeking out from behind scarves, hesitant fingers reaching toward Whisper as if she were a fragile bridge to something they had lost. A boy with a stutter would spend hours brushing her mane, each stroke a meditation, and he had begun to speak in small halting words he hadn't dared use before. A widowed mother came each afternoon, bringing her own quiet grief, and left with the faintest traces of hope stitched back into her shoulders. Even veterans who had long ago shut themselves away found themselves lingering in the barn, simply sitting beside Whisper, breathing in the warmth and calm she radiated. Calder watched it all from the doorway, leaning on the worn wood with mud-streaked hands, and felt a tremor in his chest. He had thought he was saving the horse. But the truth settled slowly, like snow melting into spring streams. Whisper was saving them all. The barn, once a hollow refuge of his own isolation, was now a sanctuary for others, stitched together by the quiet miracles of patience and care. He decided to take the next step. The old barn would become something more, a place of healing not just for animals but for people. Volunteers from town came to help him rebuild stalls, paint fences, and plant wildflowers along the edges of the pasture. Calder worked with them side by side, hands raw and calloused, moving through the motions of construction and caretaking with a quiet purpose that had been absent from his life for years. Whisper followed him everywhere, stepping lightly beside him, her presence a balm to the nervous or fearful, the broken or timid. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the barnyard, a stranger appeared at the edge of the pasture. His presence carried tension like a sudden winter wind. He claimed that Whisper had been stolen from him, that she belonged to his ranch, that the brand faintly visible on her flank was proof. Calder studied the man, noting the way he avoided looking directly at Whisper, the tight curl of his fists, the faint scent of fear or guilt clinging to him. Whisper herself froze, ears pinned, eyes wide and trembling, as though she remembered something buried deep in her memory. Calder felt a familiar knot of protectiveness tighten in his chest. The stranger demanded she be returned. Legalities were cited, threats made, but Calder's response was simple, quiet, unwavering. "She stays," he said, voice soft but firm. The town, children and veterans, mothers and neighbors, gathered behind him, a silent barrier of presence and support. They did not shout, did not argue. They simply stood, and their calm solidarity lent weight to Calder's decision. Whisper stepped forward, hesitated, then pressed her head against Calder's chest, trembling but resolute. In that moment, every doubt, every threat, every fear dissolved. She had chosen. The man's protests fell against the wall of quiet determination that had formed around Calder and the community. Authorities eventually intervened, confirming that Whisper was legally free and protected. Calder's relief was deep and wordless, settling into him with the warmth of a long-awaited sunrise. Whisper nuzzled him again, soft and trusting, as the three original horses watched from the gate, proud and patient witnesses to the truth of what had happened. The barnyard, once quiet and isolated, now hummed with life. Other horses arrived, some rescued from neglect, others abandoned or forgotten, each carrying their own weight of fear and pain. Children learned to ride, to care, to trust, discovering bravery in themselves that had long lain dormant. Veterans found quiet healing in the rhythm of grooming, feeding, and simply being present. Mothers and widowed parents came to touch, to comfort, to witness small miracles. Calder moved among them, less the solitary figure he had once been and more a steady center of patience and guidance. One crisp evening, as the sun sank behind the distant ridges, Calder and Whisper walked through the pasture, the three original horses trailing like silent sentinels. Whisper's coat gleamed in the amber light, and her eyes held a calm wisdom, as if she knew the journey they had taken together had touched more lives than either could have imagined. Calder ran his hand along her mane, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing, and allowed himself to fully exhale. Years of grief and loneliness, years of quiet despair, seemed to fall away in that moment. He understood now that this was never just about saving a horse. It had been about learning to trust, to care, to open himself fully to life again. Whisper nudged him gently, a reminder of the bond they shared, and Calder knelt in the soft grass, pressing his forehead to hers. The wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and hay, and he whispered aloud, though no one else could hear, "You saved me." Her eyes blinked slowly, a quiet acknowledgement that their healing had been mutual. Time passed. The healing ranch flourished, becoming a place where hundreds of people found solace, courage, and hope. Horses moved freely, their coats shining, their eyes bright. Children laughed openly, veterans rested with minds calm for the first time in decades. Calder walked among them all, humble and grateful, aware that the world he had once known, gray, lonely, and hollow, had transformed into something vibrant and alive. And in the quiet moments, when the sun painted the pasture gold and Whisper rested her head against his shoulder, Calder understood a profound truth. Some miracles walk on four legs. Some miracles guide us back to ourselves. Some miracles arrive when we are ready to let go of fear and receive connection. Whisper had done all that and more. He stood in the fading light, looking out over the ranch, the mountains cradling the valley in solemn majesty, and felt a deep, abiding peace. He had begun as a man burdened by grief, guided by silent insistence, and now he stood at the center of a ripple of hope and healing that extended far beyond himself. The lesson was simple yet eternal. Care, patience, and love could transform even the most broken of hearts. Now, as the wind shifted and stars began to twinkle faintly over the valley, Calder whispered to Whisper, "We did it." She nickered softly, a small sound that seemed to echo with all the lives touched by their journey. The 3 horses at the gate moved closer, forming a circle of quiet witnesses. It was a full circle, a story complete in its slow, miraculous unfolding. Now, click on the video on the screen to hear a story even more miraculous than this one. You'll cry and then feel whole again. Click it now, we'll be waiting.